Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Ambassador Mark Green, President and CEO. The Wilson Center occupies a unique place in America's foreign policy. We're congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and we're fiercely nonpartisan and independent. That special status gives us special obligations to not merely duplicate what others are doing, but to focus on the most important and to find ways to add value and offer new ideas and analysis. Well, there are few things that are more important or more urgent than the ongoing Israel-Hamas war and its impact and consequences for the region and for the world. On October 7th, Hamas forces launched a surprise terrorist attack on Israel, not only killing over 1,400 Israelis, but taking more than 200 hostage. Israeli defense forces have responded ferociously by land, sea, and air. And since October 7, we've seen numerous rockets fired into Israel from Iran-linked forces in places like Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. And we've even seen attacks upon U.S. forces in the region, 28 at last account. Thousands have been killed in Gaza, and civilians there are facing what can only be called a humanitarian catastrophe. All signs suggest that the Israeli military is now making final preparations for a land invasion into Gaza. Well, today we're going to take a moment to look beyond those dark headlines and try to understand what the broader context is and what the impacts may be. I'm joined by two distinguished senior diplomats who are no strangers to tough places and consequential events. We have the Right Honorable Baroness Catherine Ashton. Kathy, former Vice President of the European Commission and former High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. And she recently released her memoirs entitled, And Then What? Most importantly, of course, she is a Slater Family Distinguished Fellow right here at the Wilson Center. I'm also joined by Ambassador Jim Jeffrey. He has served as Deputy National Security Advisor, Ambassador to Iraq, Ambassador to Turkey, the Secretary's Special Representative for Syria engagement, and Special Envoy to the Coalition to Defeat ISIS. And most importantly, he chairs the Wilson Center's Middle East program. Two great leaders who can help us understand the context of what's happening before our eyes. Kathy, we'll start with you. So just over a year ago, you and I were sitting down in a very different context. And I was pointing out that you had met with Vladimir Putin more than most other Western leaders on the world stage. And I asked you what was driving him. Well, now we have fires burning in the Middle East, and you're one of the few diplomats that has actually been to Gaza and had the experience of trying to negotiate with Iranian leaders. The question is, what's driving them and their involvement? What can you tell us from your experience?
So there's always been a deep concern, as you know, that Iran has wanted to play a leading role in the region, and it translates that into being a dominant force. Different regimes have tempered this or made it more explicit, and this particular government has been very clear that it sees Iran as a major force in the region, and it will intervene or it will play its part as it sees most appropriate. And so I think we can expect Iran to seize the moment in a way when there is so much going on, when there is this situation that is truly dreadful happening. And we know that it has been already, working with Hezbollah in Lebanon. There are concerns about how far it's been able to provide material to Hamas. And of course, what's happening in Yemen with the Houthi population and their attacks. So there's no question that Iran is feeling its way for what it can do in the region. I have my doubts that this will translate into some kind of major action. And I am concerned that reports are coming out that the discussions it was in the very beginnings of with the United States have now kind of disappeared or been put on hold or put into the deep freeze. Because, of course, we still have this whole question of Iran's nuclear program too.
Yeah, no, very much. So there's obviously Iran and its influence and support for Hamas and the strikes on Israel, but as you sort of alluded to, it's a lot more than that now. It's in the region, particularly obviously from our perspective, against American forces. Uh, President Biden has gone to great lengths to suggest that the response that the U.S. has done against those rocket strikes has little or nothing to do with what's going on in Gaza. That seems great diplomatic talk, but a little bit far fetched. So I guess the question is how much of this has been pre planned by Iran, and how much of this is, as you just alluded to, sort of feeling their way with the situation that is chaotic, violent, obviously catastrophic in so many ways, but very chaotic.
I think I would surmise that they're really feeling their way. I mean, they obviously must have known something about what Hamas might do, but I doubt they knew anything about timing, and I doubt that they were so directly involved. But I could be wrong about that.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody quite knows when a situation as horrific as the events of October 7th happens, where it will go. You can, of course, be sure that Israel would want to seek out and bring to justice Hamas. You can be sure that there will be reactions across the world to the events, but you can't be sure how that's going to translate on the ground. So I think this is about them feeling their way rather than having thought out a plan in advance. Having said that, they will undoubtedly have thought about what they might do given the possibility of being able to launch attacks. So there won't be an element of completely thinking this through on the spot. They will have thought about it to an extent. But I think the particular circumstances, in a sense, they're doing this as they go. They don't really know where it's going to end.
And does that make the situation more complicated for everybody involved? That they're a little bit more unpredictable than they might have been. As bad as that was, does this make it even worse?
Well, it could do for sure. I mean, you've already got people leaving Lebanon, citizens from the United States, from the UK, being told that perhaps better to get out of the way. You're going to have some turbulence in the region of people moving around. You're going to have a situation where, because nobody's quite sure how this is going to move on, there are implications for many countries, from Jordan and Egypt in particular, to other Arab nations and how they respond. And of course, the situation in Iraq, you've got all of that in play. So I think it is hard to be predictable about what's going to happen. It's very hard for anyone to be able to say with certainty where this will be in a week, never mind a month or a year.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask you about, unfortunately for you. So, your terrific book, And Then What, begs the question, and then what? As we take a look at this situation, having just talked, both of us, about how unpredictable it is, what do we expect to see? What's likely to happen in Gaza, and what would the best result be given all that's moving about right now?
So I get the impression from talking to people in the region, their representatives here, and friends and colleagues who have been working very closely in the region for a long time, that there is a sense that things cannot possibly go back to what happened before. I'm reluctant to call it the status quo because that implies that it was stable, and it never really was.
Right.
That where we'll be with Gaza at the end of this is that it will be impossible to just carry on as before. And in a sense, that could be the moment to really try and force some kind of solution for the long term. Hamas obviously has to be brought to account for these terrible atrocities. But is there a future that can be worked out that will bring the greatest possible security for Israel and will also address what is needed for the Palestinian people, not Hamas, for the people who need and deserve some kind of future. And so a possible positive, it's very hard to think positive when we see so much destruction and of course the horrors of what has been happening. But a positive would be that we would actually try and address the longer term once and for all. When I said, and then what, it was because we always seem to be dealing with issues for the short term, thinking months rather than years and decades. And yet situations that arise all over the world often begin somewhere else, or they have the manifestation in another problem. And though there is no excuse under any circumstances for what Hamas has done, there is an issue for the Palestinian people that needs to be sorted out. And so I kind of hope that out of all of this tragedy, we might actually seek to address that properly. But it will, as you know better than anyone, Mark, rely very heavily on the role of the United States.
And obviously, Lord willing, it's sooner than later, but when we get to a point of cessation of hostilities, that's not an end game, right? That's has to be an intermediate step, because somehow, some way, Gaza and humanity will have to be rebuilt. So you're going to have what will be involved in building structures, the physical side of things, which requires a level of peace and security for any of it to take place. And so many of those structures will take months and years to build, so it'll be peace and stability for months and years. And arguably, that's the easy part. It's building some kind of responsive institution, governance structure in Gaza to help meet basic needs, as well as, God willing, hopes and aspirations for the people, the residents of Gaza. That will require a long-term stability. Really hard to see that right now.
It's incredibly difficult to imagine that right now. And, in the middle of this situation, we don't know what the end is. We don't know when the fighting will stop and the circumstances that will create that. We don't know. And it's impossible to imagine, I think, for so many people that they could, even think about some kind of ability to live side by side, all of that. But history shows us that eventually the most obvious and perhaps most secure way for people to go forward is to eventually find a way through. There will be, what do we do with Gaza, which is obviously in ruins in many parts. Do we just rebuild it? One of the challenges has been we've got 2.2 plus million people who live in a place where they can't get out. How do we actually address the fact that we need to not only sort out the terrorists we have, but make sure that this is about people living peacefully in the future and not about another group of terrorists appearing. There's a lot of things to do that, in a sense, will require the international community to come together and start thinking very seriously. We've talked about this stuff for decades. I think now this is probably the moment when we need to not just move forward in small steps, but actually try and address it fully.
And the irony is you have a very small place geographically. It's a tiny place.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, that means that everybody's up close and personal with everyone else. And so it requires a level of trust that really seems hard to find and piece together right now.
That's absolutely right. For people in Israel, the catastrophic and dreadful events that happen, apart from the horror of it all, people felt secure in what Israel offered to the people. And that's kind of gone for now, or it's been shaken badly if it's not disappeared. People need to know that they can be safe and secure in their country. And for the people living in Gaza who, as I said, can't get out, they are, many of them, innocent people who are caught up in this. and who are living in this extraordinary bombardment and in these terrible circumstances. There's a lot of things that seem impossible to bring together. But our job, I would argue, at the Wilson Centre, and in a sense in the international community beyond, is to think beyond the immediate and think much more about the longer term, think much more about what might be possible in the future. And how do you build, the pieces together that can create that? And it is about finding ways for people to feel secure and safe. That's got to be fundamental to it. It is about allowing people to get on with their lives. And it is going to be extraordinarily difficult. But what are the alternatives? The alternatives are to build more fences and more walls to try and solve a problem in ways that we've tried before. So I do think we have to at least contemplate the fact that out of this has to come something that is going to take us into the future in a more positive way.
Jim, let me turn to you. When October 7th erupted, the news outlets were treating it almost as a purely narrow bilateral set of issues, but very quickly the battle's been joined rhetorically and in a few places, unfortunately, militarily, by outside forces. There are a few people in this town that know Turkey better than you do, and Turkey is one of those countries that have sort of rhetorically joined. Erdogan's position seems to be hardening and hardening fast. He has said Hamas is not a terrorist organization. And then just last week, Ankara hosted Iran's foreign minister. So where is the Israel-Turkey relationship? Where was it and where is it right now? And quite frankly, where is it going?
Mark, it's not going in a good direction for sure. In the last 2 years, President Erdogan and the Israelis, particularly President Herzog, have tried to improve relations because they share many interests, mainly keeping Russia and particularly Iran from expanding in the region. The problem is Erdogan, first of all, is close to the Muslim Brothers. Secondly, he does lead a democratic country and he has elections coming up. The Palestinians are popular. And he's taking a rhetorically hard position. Now, when Erdogan takes rhetorically hard positions, they sound harsher than anybody else because that's his nature. The Israelis have pulled out their diplomats. These are all chessboard moves. Everybody will sit and wait what happens when the dust clears on the relationship, because they're working together from Azerbaijan to Iraq to Syria to contain Iran, and that's an interest that doesn't go away. So it's very complicated right now.
So let me ask you about another outside player, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has obviously expressed its strong disagreement with Israel, but not as loudly or as forcefully, perhaps, as some would have expected. What are we to make of that?
The reality of the Middle East is all over this, Mark. The Saudis and the other states of the region, this includes Turkey, know that Israel is not a geostrategic threat to them. The threat to them is a hegemonic Iran, now allied with Russia. We've seen in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Gaza, and in Yemen over the last 20 years, multiple wars, close to 1 million people killed, 15 million displaced, and 4 failed states. Nobody wants that to continue, so they're hoping that Israel can defeat Hamas, a major ally of Iran's, and deal it a strategic defeat. The problem is the people of the region in Saudi Arabia and everywhere else are sympathetic to the Palestinians' plight, and they don't want to see anybody, particularly Israelis, bombing Arab civilians. So they have to walk that line very, very carefully. It's not just what they say publicly, it's what they're saying privately, and it's what they do for real. It's not Jordan pulling its ambassador. It would be Jordan starting to cut all of the electricity, gas, and other deals with Israel. That would be a big thing, and they're not doing it.
So I'm going to, Jim, ask this first of you, and then Kathy, maybe you can respond as well. So first off, Jim, you made reference to a strategic defeat. What does a strategic defeat actually look like? Does it require Hamas to be destroyed, defanged? What does that look like? And then secondly, given, as you've just alluded to, the number of players in the Middle East who are in one way or another impacted by all this, how do you get to a strategic defeat or a peace of some kind that not only deals with that very small area we call Gaza, but all of the different players in the Middle East? What does that look like?
To start with the second, the first point will be after Hamas is defeated, and I know I owe you an answer to the first on that, you work with Gaza, and that is another building block, along with the defeat of Hamas and the so far very effective deterrence of Iran and its pals to intervene in this conflict, to change the dynamic in the Middle East to look like Iran is not winning, it is losing, it's not advancing, it is afraid to challenge America and the alliance it's put together. So that's the day after scenario in very broad terms, because the devil is in the details. In terms of defeat, that's always a difficult problem. Israel didn't think it did well against Hezbollah in 2006, but in fact, they did such damage to Hezbollah and its infrastructure, including civilian infrastructure, that Hezbollah has now been deterred for 17 years. So the first thing is to deter Hamas from doing anything else like that. But Israel needs to go further. The analogy is what we did against the Islamic State. We didn't destroy it. There's still 15,000 of them running around, but they're terrorist cells now. They're harassing the forces in Iraq and in Syria. They're not holding terrain, launching offensives, seizing cities, doing the kind of thing, for example, that Hamas did on the 7th of October. So I think that is the analogy. They won't all go away, but they won't have the strategic impact that they had on the 7th of October.
So, Kathy, particularly with that question about the players in the region, what's your reaction to that as to, how this gets, won't say get put back together, but how do we get to a place where there is some kind of a peace and all of us can move forward?
Well, I think Jim's pointed out rightly that there are lots of common interests for many of the countries of the region. And the most common of those interests is not to have Iran in the ascendancy, not to have Iran as a dominant factor in their sort of geopolitical and geostrategic thinking. So that is something that particularly the US can build on when it thinks about what kind of alliances need to be put together. As I said before, I do think that there is the glimmer of hope that a solution for the longer term that will prevent Hamas from reappearing, which is to try and support innocent Palestinians into a better future alongside an Israeli state that is safe and secure. And I know these are not fashionable right now, but I think they still have a great deal of resonance. And in terms of how this is going to work, I think we don't know quite how this dust will settle. But what we do know is that there are a number of countries in the region who are looking really carefully about where they need to be in this and where it's likely to end up. And of course, are thinking about their own domestic populations as well as their international alliances.
And Kathy, just a bit further on that point. So, we're talking obviously about the Middle East, and yet in so many parts of the world, we're starting to see the rhetoric spin up and get agitated. And how do those countries with their internal politics, how does that stabilize? I mean, you've not only got the practical right around Gaza, but hopefully getting to something for the region. But then on top of that, we've seen a hardening of positions and alliances and animosities in so many parts of the world. What does that look like? Can we get back to something that is a manageable structure?
I think there's a great deal of anger and frustration in populations. And the challenge has been really for all of us that this gets into a divided situation. So you are pro this or you're anti that, rather than recognizing that we have innocent people who are victims in this one way or another. And, when you look at October the 7th, the horror of what happened there we look at the people caught up in Israel's determination to tackle those who perpetrated this, then it really should be about what messages leaders are sending to their populations, to people, to say, we understand the pain that communities are feeling. Our job is to try and look to the future and how to find some resolutions to this. But it does play into the politics and into the way in which the international community, not just in the region, but rightly, as you say, beyond, is able to engage with this. And we shouldn't underestimate that that's going to play a role in the thinking that goes on. But it also lends itself really to an understanding that people really do want to see a much longer term strategic answer to this, and for the region to have a much stronger and more thought out strategic approach to its own relationships as well.
Jim, let me turn to you. You created a stir recently, as you often like to do, with an essay that you wrote for Foreign Affairs, in which you said that a land invasion of Gaza is Israel's least bad option. What do you mean by that, and when do you think that happens?
The fear for Israel, and I've heard this for years from senior Israeli officials, is a simultaneous attack on the country. What we saw on the 7th of October, a far bigger version of that out of the north from Lebanese Hezbollah, with Iranian and Iranian surrogates in Syria, in Yemen, and in Iran itself, raining missiles and bombs on Israel. That would stretch the Israeli military forces. It would throw Israel into, at best, a long-term war. At worst, it would threaten the state. So this is thus an existential battle for Israel. And it's not just about revenge. It's not about getting the perpetrators as if they were terrorists. You have to look at Hamas as a state in an alliance, and Israel's goal is to take that state down so that it no longer can threaten it from the south and reduce the overall military burden. It's a military problem at this point. There's political, there's terrorist, there's refugee, there's hostages and other aspects to it. At the center for Israel correctly is the military problem. And just like with the Islamic State, as I mentioned earlier, or just like the Iraqi army in Kuwait in 1991, you use military means to solve a military problem. That's what Israel is doing.
And also as a practical matter, since we're all talking about the tunnels that are beneath Gaza, this extraordinarily extensive network by all accounts, and what may be in there, sadly hostages by the sound of it, but also munitions and terrorist infrastructure. Israel's going to take it apart, which requires a bludgeoning of those tunnels with all of the collateral consequences, in some cases painful humanitarian catastrophic consequences. But isn't that what Israel's going to do? That as a practical matter, it's getting rid of an entire network of tunnels that they now realize presented a vulnerability.
Absolutely, because essentially, even when they're in the ground in Gaza City, the enemy is still beneath them. But the benefit of what the Israelis are doing now, which is slowly moving into the area, is once they have troops on the ground, they don't have to drop 2,000-pound bombs with a lot of civilian casualties to take out these tunnels. Rather, they can plant charges and do other things that they have trained for years to do. This will put Hamas in a real bind. It will have to, at some point, trade the hostages that it is still holding, because Israel cannot rescue them all, in return for some kind of ceasefire or pause that Israel will demand represents essentially a defeat of Hamas. That's where the diplomacy comes back in. We're not there yet, but once Hamas realizes that the international community and the UN General Assembly and America are not going to force Israel to stop fighting, Hamas will deal.
So for both of you have lots of experience in dealing with fragmented, chaotic conflicts and having to do diplomacy and diplomatic outreach to lots of players in lots of places. What do you think is happening right now? I mean, we hear about Secretary Blinken's keeps going back into the region, obviously needs to, but what does it look like? What should the U.S. be doing diplomatically? What do you think it is doing? And Kathy, from your perspective, same thing holds for Europeans. Let me start with you, Kathy. What does this look like? What are they doing? Help us understand the kinds of diplomatic outreach that's taking place.
Well, the first thing is to say some of it is very obvious. So what Secretary Blinken has been doing will be, traveling around the region. He'll be taking the views of those in the area. He'll have been listening carefully. And he will also have been putting forward, in some cases, in very strong terms, what the United States thinks and believes, and trying his best to get a recognition and a cohesion of view about how to go forward. There will be lots of other things going on. The Europeans are trying to do the same. You've seen leaders arriving in Israel, which is partly about solidarity, and it's partly about trying to talk about the importance of avoiding civilian casualties in Gaza. And it is undoubtedly about the beginnings of a "and then what" question to people who are, of course, most directly involved. And there'll be a lot going on behind the scenes. One of the things that's always interesting when you're involved in diplomatic activity is the importance of language. And we've seen that here in the UK, but we're seeing it everywhere. People choosing their words incredibly carefully and avoiding words which to others seem bizarre. They can't understand why people aren't talking about particular things, very directly. And the reason for that, without picking on any particular word, is often to do with what's going on behind the scenes and how people are trying to nudge and move the situation into a better place. So lots going on, lots of people involved, but the really big diplomatic efforts, frankly, will come later.
Jim, obviously, you have tremendous experience in taking on terrorist conflict and terrorist perpetrators. Your work in the coalition against ISIS, what was it like to tackle that? And you and I got to know each other in those days, but you seemed to be always in motion, all over the place, having to touch so many places and so many leaders to build the coalition, to reinforce the coalition. But wasn't it also to keep others from being more sympathetic or joining the ISIS cause?
Certainly, we had a focus, and that helped a lot. And the focus was to destroy ISIS as a military and political force. And we were more fortunate than the administration has now in that there was broad international support for that. We had 80 nations and organizations in our coalition, and it was easy to fend off those forces who might be more sympathetic or less aggressive. And thus, it was a very difficult military campaign. It had reconstruction, humanitarian, information, finance, and other aspects to it. But it was relatively straightforward compared to what the Biden administration has to face today. Because while there are many of the same elements, essentially you're dealing with two imperatives that have to dominate all of the other issues, from getting assistance in to getting our American citizens out of Gaza and such. And that is, Hamas has to be defeated and Iran has to be pushed back. Primarily, that will come from deterring Iran and friends from entering the conflict and from defeating Hamas. That is a strategic victory in and of itself. But in the welter of other issues and concerns and emergency calls from the king of one country, the prime minister of another, we may lose this focus. If we do, we'll be in trouble.
So let me ask you both to take a step back. What are the implications here for the relationship and the rubs that we have with first Russia and then China? Kathy, from your perspective.
Well, the first thing to say is, of course, we must not forget that there is still the war going on in Ukraine, and the focus of our attention is understandably at present on the Middle East. We need to recognize that we need to be very careful that that doesn't take our focus so completely away from what Russia is doing in Ukraine. From Russia's perspective, it's extraordinarily helpful if all eyes and all efforts move elsewhere. That's very important. In the broader context of our relationships with Russia and with China, in all of this, I think we are at a point when it feels to me as if the importance of trying to get some of these big questions resolved, the importance of making sure that Ukraine is successful, the importance of dealing with Hamas and then moving forward, is also about not allowing Russia to try and play its game elsewhere and to create more challenges for us. The broader context of China, well, the United States, of course, has been thinking about this a great deal, as has the UK, as has Europe. And I think it's going to be quite interesting to see, because I'm not sure that I have a strategic view yet of where China will go on this particular, not just this conflict, but in terms of the more strategic approach it's going to take to some of the challenges we've currently got.
Jim, your thoughts?
I can only follow up and agree with Kathy, but I'll take it from a slightly different direction and end where she is with China. For the last year and a half, Mark, I've been telling people we are defending Taiwan every day by standing by Ukraine. And for the last 3+ weeks, I've been saying we are defending Taiwan and Ukraine by standing by Israel. A collective security system is either global or it's like Swiss cheese, and every country that wants to depend upon us and that we have to depend upon thinks, frankly, they're the hole in that Swiss cheese and they won't be supported. What we're showing is America can back its allies, that's very, and partners and other countries. That's very important. Secondly, we have the military and diplomatic means to do so. And by showing that, two things happen. One is we get other countries to bear much of the burden. That's how we did it during the Cold War. It's much of what we're doing right now with Ukraine. And finally, look at China. It still has not given any weapons directly to Russia. It gave Putin nothing in his recent visit there, and for the first time ever, it's just agreed to open strategic nuclear talks with us, which is a huge breakthrough leading up to a Xi Biden visit. The Chinese are signaling, we don't necessarily want to challenge you because we're not sure we will win. Rather, we might want to still cooperate with you. That is what victory looks like.
Let me ask you specifically in the Russia case. Obviously, as we know, Iran's been providing drone technology and actual drones to Russian forces for some time. What do we make of that? It seems as though Iran has been flexing its muscles with drone technology for some time. Any implications one way or the other from the current conflict and the Iran-linked proxies?
Two implications. The first one, a practical, tactical one. We have, and the courage and brilliance, strategic brilliance of the Ukrainians and American and other weapons, the Russians are running out of weapons. Nobody would have thought that would happen, but they have. That's another tactical military victory. And the second lesson from this is we are dealing with a loose coalition of countries, North Korea, Iran, Russia, and as I said, and as Kathy indicated, China sort of in that camp with one foot, that are trying to overthrow the global order. And they're getting pushed back, and the major issue in the world for the next 10, 20, 30 years, apart from global warming, will be, will they succeed, or will we be able, like in the Cold War, to contain and deter these people until the danger is past?
Let me ask both of you. I'd like to hear from both of you on this. But Walter Russell Mead recently put an essay in the Wall Street Journal in which he warned that it's the erosion of deterrence, of U.S. deterrence, that is sort of the greatest danger and he pointed to as essentially the greatest problem that we've seen in the last few years. Do you agree? First off, do you agree that we're starting to see the erosion of deterrence? And if so, how serious is that, and what can we do to sort of rebuild it? Kathy?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know whether I'd say there's an erosion of deterrence. What I would say is there is somehow a move away from recognition of the ideas, values, and ideals, really, that not only America, but I would argue Europe espouse. You see it with internal divisions, you see it externally with people not being as sure about what everyone stands for and whether we're true to the vision that we have for the kind of world we think is the best world to live in. So if you like, deterrence kind of goes alongside that if you're not quite sure that the things you're looking at are as strong and as important as they were, then you could link that and say, and we're not sure whether these people maybe are as strong as we thought they were. So those things probably could go hand in hand. In terms of, though, what that means for the future, I still go back to what I think is most important is that we don't spend the time and effort to solve problems. We let them sit there and fester. We somehow think if we ignore them, they'll go away, and they don't. If you look across the world, there's so many issues that need work, that need either the regions concerned or the international community in a broader sense to come together to try and work on them. And I just think we have to start putting aside almost the partisanship that we have and say, look, we have got common problems that we need to try and solve, and we need to stick at them until we've done it.
Jim, erosion of deterrence, what do you think? Are we seeing that?
Yes, Walter Russell Mead first hopped on that theme in an essay a decade ago called The End of History, saying that all of the things we thought we buried in 1989 are back, with us ducking the red line, not responding to the Aramco hit in Saudi Arabia, and the way we pulled out of Afghanistan are all markers of that erosion of deterrence. The good news is lately, since Ukraine and now since the 7th of October, we've seen that weakening of deterrence has led to far more aggressive actions by the opponents of the world order, and we are responding. The jury is still out. We've done well in Ukraine. So far, okay with Israel, but we have to ensure that our allies are not abandoned in their struggles, or else we really will have a total deterioration of deterrence.
Final question for each of you, and a good way to pull things together. Give me a reason for optimism. What do you think can happen? What should we look forward to? Kathy?
Well, I think the reason for optimism is that we still do have a lot of brilliant diplomats working across the world. We do have a vision for the world that we want to see, and we do have a level of determination to stick with the problems and to try and sort them out. And I see that in the support that is clearly there for Ukraine. I see that in the support to try and help Israel through this set of challenges and the horrors of what happened on October the 7th, but also to try and support innocent Palestinian people into a better future. And I see that writ large in so many of the conversations I've had. So that's my reason to have a bit of optimism.
Jim, give me your optimistic note.
Right now, I don't think people are happy in the Kremlin. Right now, I don't think the people around the supreme leader in Tehran are happy. And right now, the people in China are reassessing everything they've assumed about their rise to primacy in the world and ability to compete with America. That looks like we're heading in a good direction.
Thanks to both of you for sharing your thoughts and analysis. I think it's fair that this is all to be continued. To those of you who are watching, I invite you to check out the Middle East Program's Special Collections microsite on the Hamas-Israel war, It is a veritable treasure trove of published analysis and research from current and former Wilson Center fellows. The link for that microsite is at the bottom of the screen right now. Please stay in touch and stay in tune with the Wilson Center. We'll do our very best to bring you fresh analysis and ideas. Thank you.